They sold her like dust, barefoot, unnamed, beneath her mother's silence. Then a man stepped out from the shadows, said one thing, "I'll take her." He didn't look at her. He looked at the rope. No rescue, no promises. But on a porch where even the coffee stayed cold for years, something lost began to breathe again. Stay till the end, because some stories don't start with love, they start with mercy. Part 1. The wind didn't move in Dry Rock. Dry Rock was the kind of town where even the dust looked the other way. No one knew who first stood up the auction plank in the square. Maybe it had been for livestock, maybe old tools or broken saddles. But that morning, just past high sun, it held something else. A girl. Barefoot, shoulders square but hands curled like she was waiting for something to fall, or maybe waiting for nothing at all. She was young, 19 by guess, maybe younger if you looked past the set jaw and into the eyes that didn't blink when folks passed by. Her dress hung in folds too thin for August heat, hair tied back with a rag that had seen better years. Beside her stood a woman with graying roots and a voice sharp enough to skin hide. "This one's strong," the woman barked. "No talk back, no wasting food. Take her off my hands and you'll thank yourself by winter." She didn't say daughter, didn't say name, just flicked a wrist like she was swatting flies from a porch. The girl, Clara, though nobody knew it yet, didn't shift, didn't plead, didn't even raise her chin. She just stood, still as a barn beam. Her wrists were bound, though loosely, not tight like someone feared escape, more like a ceremony, a formality to say, "This one ain't hers no more." The rope was frayed, more for show than restraint, but it might as well have been iron. Nobody in the square said a word. They watched like they were watching chickens peck or dogs fight, some with pity disguised as curiosity, others with the hollow stare of folks who'd seen too much to be moved by anything anymore. The blacksmith's boy shifted his weight, turned away. Mrs. Gaines, the preacher's wife, pressed her lips thin and walked faster with her basket of flour. Old Mr. Willett muttered something about how these things didn't happen here, even as he didn't look away. But still, no one moved. Not a coin tossed, not a question raised. The sun hung above like a silent judge, and even the wind, usually whispering through the cottonwoods, stayed hushed, like Dry Rock itself was holding its breath. And Clara had long since stopped waiting for someone to speak for her. Her shame wasn't loud anymore. It sat behind her ribs like a brick, unmoved and unmoving. This wasn't her first sale. She remembered the first time, a man in Kansas with boots too clean and a voice that dripped honey until the doors closed behind her. She remembered the second, a mining cook who didn't ask her name, just if she could carry water. This time her mother brought her. "This one ain't worth keeping," the woman had muttered under her breath the night before by the wagon fire. "Too soft, too slow, too much like her daddy." And Clara hadn't answered, not because she agreed, but because she knew her voice didn't count anymore. Somewhere along the trail from New Mexico to Dry Rock, she'd laid it down and forgotten where. A few men in the square scratched their chins. One made a motion like he might say something, then saw the rope, saw the look in Clara's eyes, and thought better of it. Not out of decency, just out of unease. You don't buy what might come with a ghost inside it. Her mother lifted her chin, barked again. "A strong back for harvest, no debts, take her now, or I'll leave her tied to the water trough by dusk." Still, no one moved. And the girl just stood, her toes curled into the hot dirt, her eyes locked on a nail sticking out of the post beside her. She wasn't looking for rescue, wasn't hoping, not anymore. Hope was something you used up like sugar or kindling, and she'd long run out. She just waited, like a rock waits for the river to pass. The silence stretched. Townsfolk shuffled. Somewhere a dog barked and was hushed. A baby cried and was pulled close. Clara's hair stirred a little in the sun, but the wind still didn't come. Then boots, not hurried, not loud, just steady, heavy. From the alley behind the blacksmith's shop, a man stepped into the square. Elias Boone hadn't been seen in Dry Rock for the better part of 2 seasons. Folks said he lived up past Lone Hollow, where the canyon bent sharp and the fence lines disappeared into brush. Said his land was more rock than crop. Said he hadn't spoken to anyone proper since his wife died 3 winters back. Some said he'd buried her himself when the storm blocked the pass. Others said he'd left her there to die. But that morning Elias Boone stepped into the sun with dust on his shoulders and quiet in his chest. His eyes swept the square once. Over the dry goods store, the graying post office, the single-window saloon, and landed on the girl by the post. He didn't ask what she'd done, didn't ask what she was worth, didn't even ask her name. He just said, low and plain, like it was nothing, "I'll take her." A hush dropped. Clara blinked. Slow, like a window left open in a storm. Her mother raised her eyebrows. "You got coin?" Elias reached into his coat, pulled out a few bills. Folded flat, no flourish. "That's enough." The woman shrugged. "She's yours." And just like that, Clara was handed off. Not with ceremony, not with grace, just a nod and a loosening of rope. The square didn't cheer. No one clapped. A few folks looked away. Others looked at Elias like he was digging up something best left buried. But he didn't flinch. He just turned and started walking, slow and quiet, back the way he came. Clara followed. Not because she knew where she was going. Not because she trusted him. But because, for the first time in a long while, no one asked her to beg for it. And because even in that moment, with heat in her throat and shame in her gut, there was something about the way the wind followed behind his boots, like maybe it had been waiting too. Part 2. The Man Who Paid Without Bargaining. The sun had climbed halfway past the courthouse roof when he stepped from the shadow of the blacksmith's lean-to. Elias Boone, long and broad-shouldered, wore a dust-colored coat that looked like it had lived through 5 winters and 1 woman's death. He moved like someone who didn't care to be noticed, and yet the space around him seemed to pause a little when he entered it, like the world remembered something. Clara didn't see him right away. Her mother was still talking in that half-joking, half-bitter tone that made folks chuckle just enough to feel less guilty. "She don't eat much," the woman said, slapping dust off her skirt. "And she don't backtalk. That alone ought to be worth $1 or 2. No one laughed anymore, though. There was something about the way Clara stood, shoulders square, eyes cast down, hands folded in front like she was already gone. Her silence made the town feel louder than it liked to be. A man in a boiled vest cleared his throat. "This a real sale or just another game, Maggie?" "She's mine," Clara's mother said. "Ain't that enough?" Then Elias spoke, just 3 words. "I'll take her." It wasn't a shout, just low and steady, like the voice of a river you'd forgot was there until it came rising up again. Everyone turned like something had shifted underfoot. The woman blinked. "You ain't asked what she costs." "I reckon you'll take the coins I have," he said, stepping forward. His boots hit the wood of the platform like slow thunder. He didn't look at Clara, not yet. He looked at her mother instead, right in the eyes. She hesitated, as if unsure whether she should laugh, spit, or run. Then she took the money. 3 silver dollars, 1 chipped at the edge, a small pouch of oats, and something else she couldn't name, something old in his eyes that made her stop smiling. Clara didn't lift her head, but her mother shoved her forward by the arm, muttering something bitter and triumphant, and left without looking back. Elias turned to her, didn't offer a hand, didn't offer a name, just gave a small nod as if to say, "You can walk beside me if you want." She did. The crowd scattered the way dry leaves do when wind finally finds them. A few folks whispered. One boy, maybe 12, watched them with wide eyes from the edge of the well. "Isn't that the one whose wife died all alone?" Someone muttered, not quietly enough. "Yeah," came the reply, hushed. Boone Hollow thought he was buried up in them hills with her. But Elias didn't turn back. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, headed for the wagon hitched by the livery. Clara followed. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't say. When she climbed into the seat beside him, it was as if her legs decided on their own. Maybe they were just tired of standing still. The mule's name was Jasper, gray around the ears, thick-ankled, moved like he'd walked the same path too many times to forget it now. Elias gave him the lightest nudge, and the wagon began its quiet roll out of Dry Rock. No one waved, no one stopped them, not even the shopkeeper who had once sold Clara a pin and called her sweet girl when she was 10. The town square faded behind them, and with it the sound of Clara's mother laughing. Only dust and the soft creak of old wood remained. Elias didn't speak, just handed her a canteen. She took it, not because she trusted him, but because the road ahead looked long, and she hadn't had water that didn't taste like iron in 3 days. Somewhere behind them, the wind finally stirred, knocked over the crate Clara had been standing on. No one picked it up. Part 3. A wagon without questions. The wagon moved like it had all the time in the world, and maybe it did. There wasn't much that chased Elias Boone anymore. Not people, not memories, not even God, far as he could tell. Clara sat beside him without shifting. Her back stayed straight, hands still in her lap. Not once did she ask where they were headed. Not once did she ask what he meant by, "Take her." She just rode, eyes forward like a person trying not to spook anything inside herself. The land stretched out before them in long, dry sighs. Scrub cedar, brown brush, broken fence posts leaning like tired men. The sky was wide, but not kind. Clouds drifted like ghosts, unsure of their next haunting. Even the birds seemed to keep quiet. Jasper, the mule, didn't hurry, didn't need to. His hooves made a rhythm out of old wagon boards and stubborn ground. Every so often Elias reached down and rubbed the animal's withers with his knuckles. A habit, not a thought. Clara noticed but didn't speak on it. They passed a creek where the water had shrunk into a silver trickle. Clara glanced at it. Elias saw the way her eyes followed it, like it was an old friend trying to make one last visit. "You thirsty?" he asked. She nodded once. He pulled the wagon off the road, into a spot where cottonwoods made a little shade, climbed down first, then offered her the canteen again. She didn't take it right away, not until he set it on the edge of the wagon seat and stepped back. She drank slowly, careful, like someone who'd been punished once for wanting too much. Then she stopped. He waited, didn't ask anything. That silence between them, it wasn't cold, just heavy like a blanket too thick for spring. She looked out toward the open land and said the first words since they left Dry Rock. "That mule old." Elias nodded. "'Bout 20, stubborn as fence rot." Clara gave the faintest smile, not on her lips, just somewhere near the corner of one eye. "That's a good thing," she said. "Stubborn things last." He didn't reply, just stood there, watching Jasper flick his ears like he was swatting at years. When they got moving again, something had shifted. Not much, but enough. Clara's hands weren't folded tight anymore. They rested open on her skirt. Elias pointed once toward a far hill. That ridge line, Boone Hollows just beyond it. Clara didn't ask how far, didn't ask if she was to stay there forever. He didn't say. The wagon creaked on, slow and sure, into the dipping afternoon. At one point the road narrowed and passed a field of wild sunflowers, ragged, half dead, still standing, the kind of thing no one plants but that shows up anyway. Clara reached out, not to pick one, just touched a yellow petal as they passed. It bent under her finger and sprang back. She didn't look at Elias, but he saw it, that small gesture, that flicker of memory of a girl who once liked color, maybe, or softness. They said nothing all the way down the trail, not until the ridge dipped and Boone Hollow opened up before them, with its tired fence, its leaning porch, its chimney like a crooked finger pointing nowhere. Still, Clara made no sound, but she didn't flinch either, and when Jasper stopped, she waited for Elias to climb down first, which he did. Then she followed, not because she was told, just because for now it felt like the next right step. Part 4. A house without locks or laughter. The house stood where the land had folded inward like it was trying to remember something. Boone Hollow wasn't much. Just a weather-worn cabin of gray wood and sagging corners, slouched into the dust like an old man who'd run out of stories to tell. One shutter hung crooked. The door leaned but held. The fence had more gaps than rails, and even the chickens looked uncertain if they still lived here. But it was quiet, not in the way that emptiness is, more like the silence of a place that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. Elias didn't say much when they arrived. He pulled Jasper to the shade of a crumbling lean-to, patted the mule's flank, then stepped up onto the porch. The boards creaked under his weight, not complaining, just remembering. He unlocked nothing, just pushed the door open and stood aside. Clara didn't ask permission. She stepped inside with careful feet, the way you do when entering a room that once belonged to someone else, or maybe still did. Inside, the house held its breath. Dust caught the light from a high window, spinning in slow dances. A table sat to the left, square, scarred, and set for one. One chipped mug, one knife, one plate with the fork still resting across it, like someone had stopped mid-bite years ago. A fire hadn't been lit while the hearth held only the memory of ash. There were no curtains on the windows, just wood frames and the pale ghosts of handprints where someone once reached to look out. One chair, Clara said, more to herself than to him. Elias heard her but didn't reply. He walked toward the stairs and nodded upward. Rooms upstairs, to the right. There's water in the basin. Then he turned toward the back of the house and said over his shoulder, "Kitchen's that way." That was all. No welcome, no warning, but no orders either, just space. Clara climbed the stairs slowly, her hand never quite touching the rail. The steps creaked, but not loud, like they didn't want to startle her. Upstairs, the room was plain, a small bed, quilt folded at the end, a wash basin on a rickety table, a single drawer that didn't pull out smooth, no mirror, no trinkets, just the faint scent of cedar and an old shawl folded on the sill. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. This wasn't hers, but it wasn't someone else's anymore either. Downstairs, Elias moved through the house with the slowness of a man who had gotten used to his own company. Not bitter, just practiced. He took a pot from the hook, filled it with water, and set it on the stove. Outside, wind pressed gently against the walls, as if testing their strength. Nothing fell, nothing groaned. Clara came down later, hair damp from washing. Her clothes had dried stiff. She held them like they might collapse if let go. Elias pointed to a small wooden chest near the corner. "There's some things in there. My sister left them, years back, before she married off east." Clara said nothing, just nodded once, knelt, and opened it. Inside were 2 folded skirts, a blouse with embroidery at the hem, and a shawl that smelled faintly of soap that no longer existed. She chose the plainest skirt, changed in the kitchen pantry. They didn't eat dinner that night, just coffee and silence. But before she went back up to bed, Elias paused at the base of the stairs, held out a folded shawl, not the one from the chest, a thicker one, dark brown, warm. He didn't speak. She didn't thank him, but she took it. And that night, when she entered the room again, she didn't shut the door all the way. She left it open just a crack, not out of fear, but because she could. Part 5. The Quiet Kindness of Shared Chores. Boone Hollow had its own rhythm. Not fast, not slow, just steady. Like wind through a canyon, it didn't need to shout to move things. That first morning, Clara rose before Elias. She stood barefoot in the kitchen, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching dust shift in the pale light. The stove was still cold, but she knew its parts like she'd been born near iron and fire. There was a kettle, a sack of ground coffee, and a pile of kindling, just damp enough to complain. She struck the flint the way her grandmother once taught her, knees bent, shoulders still. The fire caught slow but sure, and by the time Elias came down the stairs, the smell of weak coffee floated in the air like a promise no one dared speak aloud. He didn't comment, just nodded once and poured himself a tin cup, poured another, left it on the table, and walked outside. She didn't touch it, not that day, but she noted the gesture. 2 cups instead of 1. That afternoon, Clara found a broom in the corner and swept the front room clean. Moved slow so the dust wouldn't rise too fast. She didn't ask if it was her place to do so, just knew she needed to move, to make something quiet inside herself fall into order. She stacked kindling in neat rows under the lean-to, folded the dish towels that had grown stiff from disuse, took a knife to the bread crust left on the table and cut it into manageable halves, one for today, one to dry for later. Elias passed her once with a saddle blanket slung over his shoulder. He paused at the banister, set something down, then continued on. When she climbed the stairs later, she saw what it was, a shawl, a different one, finer weave, worn at the edges but clean and folded. He hadn't said a word. That evening, when the sky turned the color of old pennies, Clara stepped out to the porch and sat in the second chair. She didn't know why, just that it was there. It had dust on the seat, but she brushed it off with her sleeve. Elias sat beside her a while later. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. He sipped his coffee. She kept her hands folded in her lap. The air between them wasn't heavy, just waiting, like a field before planting. When the coyotes yipped in the distance, Clara didn't flinch. She knew that sound, had heard it in other places under darker skies, but here it didn't feel like a warning. That night she left her door ajar again, a little wider this time, not because she feared the dark, but because she wasn't quite ready to close herself in yet. Downstairs, Elias sat by the dying fire, cup still warm in his hands. He didn't look toward the stairs, didn't move to check on her. He just sat there. The silence in the house wasn't empty anymore. It was becoming something else, a rhythm. As Part 6, a crack in the silence. The next morning, frost rimmed the porch rail. Clara stepped outside with the broom and paused. Elias was already there, seated in his usual chair, boots planted wide, hat low over his brow. Steam curled from the tin cup in his hand, catching the first rays of sun like breath from a tired horse. He didn't look at her, didn't speak. She began sweeping, small motions, careful not to disturb his quiet. When she passed behind his chair, she noticed something on the porch wood, a notch, like a blade had pressed down once, twice, maybe more. The kind a man makes when he's waiting for someone who doesn't come home. That afternoon, the saddle cinch broke. Clara found Elias in the barn, kneeling beside the black gelding, hands firm and sure as he tied rawhide through the torn strap. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing a forearm lined with sun and years. She didn't mean to ask, but her voice slipped out anyhow. Did she like horses? Elias didn't glance at her, just kept tightening the knot. My wife, he said, voice low like dry timber, never cared much for saddles. Said the land moved too fast when you weren't on your own feet. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees. She got caught in a snowstorm 3 winters back, out by Salt Fork. I was fixing a roof over at Mrs. Loring's when it rolled in. Figured she was at home, near the fire. He looked toward the stall window. Wind ticked against the boards, soft but steady. But she wasn't. Clara didn't speak. I didn't look right away, Elias continued. Didn't notice she was gone till supper stayed cold. By then, it was too late. Found her curled under the cedar grove. Still had her boots on. A silence settled between them. Not from discomfort, but reverence. Like both were standing beside something too sacred to touch. She was kind, he said after a long breath. Kinder than I ever earned. But I figured after that, I didn't get to want things anymore. Not family, not peace, not a second chance. He turned then, slow and tired. Clara met his eyes for the first time that day, and for once he didn't look like worn leather. They looked like old wounds trying to hold shape. She didn't say sorry, didn't offer comfort. Instead, she walked past him, picked up the folded blanket he'd left for her on the barn railing the night before, and took a minute to smooth its edges out over the hay bale. Her fingers moved with care, tight corners, neat lines, like she was folding something more important than just wool. Elias watched without asking why, because some things don't need to be named. That night, Clara lit the fire before Elias returned from mending the fence. She placed 2 tin cups on the table again, one for him, one untouched, but closer to her seat than the night before. When he stepped inside, he noticed, didn't comment, only nodded. And for the first time since she arrived, the air between them wasn't heavy with past or silence. It held something else. Recognition. Part 7. The slap behind the counter. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when Clara tied her hair back and reached for her shawl. The town of Dry Rock sat 8 miles down the dirt track, and the mule, Jasper, was only good for a steady walk, not speed. But the flour bin had been near empty, and Elias had simply said, "Take what we need. Account's still good at Doyle's." He handed her the coins and didn't come with her. Didn't say she had to go alone either. Jasper plodded into town like he remembered every rut, every porch board with a loose nail. Clara rode straight-backed, quiet, eyes ahead. The people in Dry Rock turned only slightly, just enough to notice, not enough to acknowledge. Most knew who she was now, or thought they did. The girl from the square, the one he bought. At the dry goods store, Rachel Doyle greeted her kindly enough, though her eyes lingered a bit too long. Clara offered a thin smile, one that tried not to waver, and turned toward the back where the thread and flour were kept. She had just reached out for a spool, something soft-colored, pale blue like spring skies, when a sharp sound cracked the air. A hand had struck her wrist. "Don't touch that," came the hiss. It was Mrs. Doyle, the shopkeeper's wife. "You don't get to dirty things meant for honest homes." Clara didn't flinch. Not quite. She pulled her hand back slowly, fingers curling against her palm. People watched. 3 of them, maybe more. None stepped forward, not even Rachel. Clara turned to leave without a word. The thread stayed on the shelf, untouched, like it always had been. But the bell above the door rang again. Elias, he didn't stomp, didn't rush, just walked in, dust on his boots, hat still low. His eyes found Clara's first, not her wrist, not the shame flushed on her cheek, just her eyes. Then he turned to Mrs. Doyle, looked her straight in the face. "She's under my roof," he said simply. "That makes her part of what's mine to protect." He didn't raise his voice, didn't ask for an apology, just stated it plain, like saying the fence line ran west or the sky turned red come dusk. The silence after was long. Mrs. Doyle stepped back. Rachel cleared her throat. "I'll pack your things, Clara," she said quietly. "You go ahead and wait outside." Clara walked out, slow and steady, hands by her sides. Jasper flicked his ears as she neared. She didn't cry, but her hand rested on the mule's neck longer than it needed to. Inside, Elias didn't speak another word, just paid, took the thread too, and when they rode back together in silence, Clara didn't ask why he came. She just knew somehow he'd seen her hand, the one struck, and decided it wouldn't happen again without someone standing close. When they arrived at Boone Hollow, he helped her down from the wagon, a quiet motion, familiar now. Then he handed her the thread, pale blue. She nodded once and took it. That night she stitched a single line along the inside seam of the shawl he'd left for her days before. No one would see it, but she'd know it was there. A small line that said, "I stayed because someone did too." Part 8. The Storm in the Horse Barn. The first rumble came distant, like hooves far off on a hard-pan road. Then the sky gave way the way it always did in Boone Hollow, fast, rough, and without asking. Elias had just rolled the last of the tools into the barn when the downpour came. Clara had followed with an armload of kindling, though neither of them spoke. Storms had a way of making words small, but when the lightning split the clouds wide open, Elias noticed her pause, not a flinch, a stilling, like prey trained to freeze before it was hunted. He didn't say anything, only reached for a lantern, lit it low, and set it by the empty horse stall. The old mule, Jasper, huffed quietly nearby, head down, unbothered by the thunder. Clara sat on a crate beside the tack wall. Her dress hem was damp, and a few strands of hair clung to her cheek. Her hands were tucked tight beneath her arms, not for warmth, but to keep them from trembling. Elias busied himself with oiling the saddle straps, not watching her, not needing her to speak. The silence in the barn stretched thin, strung tight by the steady drum of rain against the roof. Then came her voice, not strong, not steady, just there. "I've been sold 3 times, she said. "Once by a cousin, once by a man I was told would marry me, and once by my mother." She didn't look at him, just at the dirt floor where the water ran in narrow threads along the edge. "The last one told me I talked too much. The first told me I was too quiet. The middle one never looked at my face." Elias didn't move, didn't breathe too loud. She shifted on the crate, and her voice thinned. "My mother said girls who cry get killed, so I learned to smile when I bled." The lantern flickered. Jasper brayed soft and low. Somewhere in the corner the wind carried in the scent of wet hay and old leather. Clara pulled something from her pocket, a scrap of cloth, small and worn. Her thumb ran over it. "He had a scar," she said, "the one before you. Said I was property. Said I could be marked." Her hands trembled now, but she didn't try to hide them. "I was 15 when I first knew what it meant to be owned." It came out like gravel in her throat. Not a sob, not a plea, just truth, dragged through time. Elias set the saddle down slowly, walked to the stall gate, leaned both hands on the rail. "You're still here," he said simply. "That matters more than anything." She looked up then, just for a moment. "And if I leave?" "You'll still matter." She let out a breath that cracked in the middle, like something had been holding tight behind her ribs for years and had just snapped loose. Outside, the storm roared louder. Inside, neither of them moved. They just stayed. He didn't reach for her, didn't offer a hand, only stood close, long enough for the worst of the storm, inside her and outside, to pass. When she stood to go, she didn't fold the cloth away. She let it drop into the kindling basket, where it smoldered gently beside the damp wood. That night, for the first time, she shut her door all the way, not because she feared what might come in, but because she knew who was outside, and for now, that was enough. Part 9. The Mule That Wouldn't Move. The morning after the storm, Boone Hollow was quiet in that heavy way. Land gets after rain. Not quite awake, but listening. The clouds hadn't broken yet. The earth still breathed slowly, soaking in what it had been given. Clara came down the stairs before the coffee was done. Her boots were laced tight. The bag by her side was patched from a feed sack, half filled. A canteen hung off one strap. She wore the old shawl he'd left for her nights ago, but folded neat beneath it was the red cloth, the same one she'd burned a piece of the night before. Elias looked up from the stove but didn't speak. He didn't ask where she was going, didn't ask if she'd be back. He just said, "Jasper's already hitched. Feed's in the wagon." She gave a nod. Not goodbye, just acknowledgement. And maybe that was more honest anyway. Outside, the air was still thick with damp, the barn wood darker from rain. She climbed into the wagon, sat where the seat had worn thin from years of hauling more burden than comfort. Jasper stood ready, the harness creaking slightly as he shifted weight. The reins rested in her hands like a question she hadn't decided how to answer yet. Elias didn't come to the gate, just leaned against the porch rail, coffee in hand, watching the slow stretch of road beyond the trees. She gave the reins a nudge. Nothing. Jasper flicked his ears but didn't move. She clicked her tongue once, then again. Another soft pull. Still nothing. The old mule blinked slowly and let out a grunt, the kind that sounded more like stubbornness than effort. Clara exhaled, half a laugh, half a curse, and stepped down. She checked the harness, the wheels, the bit, everything in place. Still nothing. She stepped back onto the wagon, sat still for a minute, and stared down the road. Then turned, not to Elias, but to the mule. "You gonna make me say it?" she whispered. Jasper didn't flinch, didn't move. "I thought freedom meant going." She looked toward the hollow's edge. The world beyond it felt too wide and too thin all at once. "I thought maybe if I left before it got soft, before it got real." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't have to. Jasper lowered his head like he'd heard it all before from better folks, and was tired of waiting for humans to figure out what animals already knew. Elias's voice came from the porch, quiet, steady. "Freedom's not about running, it's about choosing." Clara sat back, the reins still in her lap. The road open, but she didn't move, didn't leave. Not that day, not anymore. Instead, she climbed down again, this time without hurry. Unhitched Jasper, walked him back to the barn by his lead, slow like one does with something that's never betrayed them. She didn't look toward Elias when she passed the porch, but when she got to the door, she paused, hand on the frame. "I'll fix breakfast," she said. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't surrender. Just a woman, still finding her voice, choosing to use it. The screen door closed soft behind her. Inside, the skillet warmed. Coffee brewed. The morning light crept through slats and settled on 2 chipped mugs set side by side. And outside, Jasper dozed in his stall, satisfied, because even a mule could tell when someone had stopped running. Part 10. A question without a ring. The fence line behind the barn had 3 posts rotted to the root. Clara had noticed it days ago, but said nothing. Figured it wasn't her land to worry over, not yet. Maybe not ever. She spent that morning slicing bread, her hands slow. The fire took longer than usual to catch. Elias had left before sunrise. No note, no boots on the steps. Just the coffee pot still warm and the second cup filled, set quietly on the table across from hers. She hadn't touched it. Not yet. By noon she found him at the north field, sleeves rolled up, dirt caked past his wrists. He was digging up one of the dead posts, a pile of hand-split cedar stakes beside him, the same kind he'd used back when the fence meant something more than marking boundaries. She watched him from the gate for a long minute before walking closer. He didn't look up, just kept digging. She stepped to the side, boots quiet on the grass. "If I stay?" she asked, her voice barely louder than wind brushing cottonwood. "What am I?" The question hung, not like a demand, more like a stone too long carried. Elias didn't answer. Not then. Didn't offer comfort. Didn't reach for her. Instead, he drove the shovel in deep again, set a boot to the top and pressed. Clara stayed, watching. She thought he hadn't heard. Thought maybe her words had floated off with the wind, just like all the ones she'd whispered to herself during years when no one listened. But then, after the silence had done its work, Elias pulled the old post free, laid it in the grass, and stood with his back to her. "If you're my wife," he said, quiet and solid, "we'll need to fix this fence." No ring, no promise scrawled in flowered ink, just a man choosing not to explain his heart, but to anchor it in cedar and soil. Clara felt the weight of it, what that meant, how a proposal could live in hands worn by work, not in words practiced by men in clean suits. She didn't smile, but something in her shoulders let go. She stepped forward, picked up one of the new posts, ran her fingers down its rough edge. Then, without a word, she knelt beside the hole he'd dug, held the base steady while he began packing dirt around it. The wind picked up slightly, enough to stir the hem of her dress and blow a lock of hair across her face. Elias reached out gently, brushing the hair back behind her ear, a gesture so brief it might have been missed by anyone who hadn't lived a whole life waiting for it. They worked the rest of the day in rhythm. No ceremony, no crowd, just two people mending something broken together. By evening, 6 posts stood straight again, aligned like quiet sentries. Clara leaned on one, hands aching, dirt beneath her nails. Elias poured her a tin of water and passed it over without looking away from the fence line. She took it and drank deep, then sat beside him in the grass, legs stretched, dusk settling. "I never thought love looked like this," she murmured. He glanced sideways. "Like splinters and sunburn." She shook her head. "Like being held up, even if the wind's bad." He didn't respond. Didn't have to. His hand found hers in the space between them, calloused and steady. No ring, just pressure, just choice. Part 11. A wedding with no witnesses. There was no preacher, no white dress, no pews, no rustling crowd or music drawn on fiddle strings. Just the creek behind Boone Hollow, low from a dry season, winding its way through rock and cottonwood, whispering as if it knew the names of those who needed its silence. Elias had shaved that morning, not clean-shaven, just enough to dull the edge of weather-beaten whiskers. He'd brushed off his only good shirt, the one with the stitched cuffs and the faint scent of cedar still caught in the collar. It hadn't been worn since before Boone Hollow got quiet. He didn't say why he'd pulled it from the chest. Didn't need to. Clara came down the stairs in the same dress she'd arrived in, washed, mended, sleeves rolled. But tied around her wrist was a strip of red calico. It wasn't much, just a torn bit from an old dress once meant for dancing. She'd found it in the back of the cupboard, tucked beside a jar of lavender that had long since dried. She tied it like a promise, not flashy, not loud, just there. Elias was waiting by the creek, hands in his pockets, hat tilted against the sun. Clara crossed the yard barefoot, her soles already used to the ground. When she reached him, he didn't take her hand, just looked at her, long and quiet. "You sure?" he asked. His voice wasn't trembling, but it wasn't steady either, like a man who'd built a wall not to keep people out, but because he didn't believe anyone would ever try to come in. Clara didn't nod, didn't smile, just stepped closer and said, "I don't know if I deserve this." There was a hush then, not an awkward silence, but the kind that lets truth rest without rush. Elias looked down, thumb tracing the edge of his palm. "Neither do I," he said, "but I'm not walking away from it." No audience needed more than that. So they stood beneath the cottonwoods while the breeze moved gently through the branches, the sun caught in the creek like a blessing no one asked for, and time slowed, not out of reverence, but recognition. They didn't kiss, didn't make vows. There was no paper signed, no ring exchanged. But they left that spot different, bound not by what they'd said, but by what they hadn't needed to. When they returned to the house, Clara placed 2 cups on the table, one for her, one for him. Elias added a log to the hearth, even though it was too warm to need it, just so it wouldn't be cold. That night they didn't lock the door, didn't close their rooms. They weren't strangers trying to live side by side anymore. They were something quieter, chosen, unfolding slowly, like spring breaking through hard ground. Part 12. The Cloth That Carried a New Name. The next morning came with a kind of stillness that didn't feel empty anymore. Clara woke early, same as always, but this time she didn't rush. No task drove her down the stairs. No fear kept her steps light. She simply moved. Deliberate, grounded. The air inside Boone Hollow felt warmer, though the fire hadn't yet been lit. Sunlight touched the windowsill, where a spider's web stretched like lace between the frame and the old clay jar of molasses. Clara brushed her fingers across the edge of the table as she passed, not wiping dust, just feeling the grain of the wood. She wasn't cleaning. She was noticing. The cloth came out of her satchel, the same one she'd kept tucked under her bed since the night Elias brought her home. It was rough linen, pale and plain, not much to look at, but her fingers moved with memory, folding the edges, threading the needle. She stitched quietly at the kitchen table, the fire crackling now behind her, Elias outside tending to the fence line. On that cloth she didn't sew flowers or initials, no fancy birds or scripture. She sewed 2 names, Boone and Clara, and beneath it, in small, careful letters, not kept, but chosen. That last part took her the longest. Not because the thread was tricky, but because those 4 words had weight. Like putting down a load she'd carried across too many years, across too many places that didn't want her to stay. By midday, she hung it above the hearth, not framed, not centered, just pinned at the corners where it could flutter gently whenever the door opened or the fire warmed the room. Later, Elias came in, boots caked with dirt, sweat darkening the rim of his hat. He looked at the cloth, looked at her, didn't speak, didn't need to. He walked to the shelf, lifted the photograph of his wife, the one that had always sat on the mantel, quiet and untouched, and, without drama or apology, opened the drawer beside the stove. He placed it inside, closed it softly. Clara didn't ask what it meant. She knew. The photo wasn't thrown away. It wasn't forgotten, but it was no longer holding the front seat of his life. Now there was space for something else, not to replace, just to live beside. That night they ate in the quiet hum of the firelight, beans, bread, stew that she'd seasoned just the way Elias liked, even if he never said how he liked it. He'd paused longer than usual after the first bite. That was all the confirmation she needed. After dinner, Clara stood by the hearth for a while, one hand resting near the stitched cloth. Elias moved beside her, slow and solid, and for the first time their shoulders touched and stayed there. They didn't call it home, didn't speak the word family. But something in the room shifted, like the rafters themselves had let out a long-held breath. Outside, a coy dog howled across the hollow. Inside, the fire answered with a soft hiss. And above the flame, that piece of cloth swayed just slightly, as if nodding toward the truth. This house once held ghosts. Now it held a woman, and she had written her name in it. Part 13. The town called her by name. The town of Dry Rock never forgot a bad story. But sometimes, if you stayed long enough, it forgot how to retell it cruelly. It was the kind of town where names stuck fast and silences even faster. Clara had been there once before, barely clothed and not called anything. Her worth had been a price, her presence an embarrassment, her touch unwelcome. But this morning, the wind brought in something else, not soft, not grand, just a stillness that lets things be different. Clara walked the dirt street with a steady pace, not slow, not rushed. Her boots kicked up dust like everyone else's now. She wore a plain blue dress, one Rachel Doyle had handed her a week prior with a quiet nod, nothing more. And over her wrist, the same red scarf she'd worn the day she married Elias down by the creek. She passed the general store. Nobody looked away. A man lifted his hat. A young girl offered a smile before turning shy again. It was small, but it happened. Rachel had asked for help, a baptism dress for her sister's baby, said her hands were tired, her eyes not what they used to be. Clara said, "I'd be honored." Simple as that. No one gasped, no one argued. They sat on Rachel's porch that day, two women sewing with heads bent, thimbles catching the sunlight, and then it happened. Small, almost careless, like a stone dropped in a shallow creek. Rachel called her Mrs. Boone. Not with mockery, not with curiosity, just like it was true. The word settled in the air like it had been there all along, waiting for the right voice to speak it. Clara didn't correct her, didn't blink, just tied off a thread and passed Rachel the spool. That afternoon, two older women came by to drop off linen scraps for the baptism gown. One of them hesitated at the bottom of the steps. The other said, "We heard you're the one folks talk to now if they need fine needlework." Clara didn't look up right away. She was threading a new needle, hands steady as fence wire. Then she said, without edge or pride, "I'll help if I can." And that was that. No grand declarations. No tearful apologies from the town that once let her stand in the dust like livestock. Just a slow shift in the current. The kind that doesn't knock trees down, but bends the grass in a new direction. That night, back at Boone Hollow, Clara stood by the open window while Elias poured 2 mugs of coffee. She told him about the sewing, about the women, about Rachel's words. "She called me Mrs. Boone," she said. There was something like a smile in her voice, not full, not easy, but earned. Elias didn't answer right away. He stirred sugar into her mug, slid it across the table, and sat across from her like always. Then he said, "That sounds right." They drank in silence after that, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the kind people grow into, when words aren't needed because the porch holds them, the floor remembers, and the names spoken in town no longer. Come with shame. Out the window the moon hung low and round over Dry Rock. In the distance coyotes yipped, but the sound didn't feel threatening anymore. Just part of the place. Just like she was now. Part 14. A house that breathed again. The morning started like most others, cool air, faded sun, the kind of breeze that held its breath between seasons. Coffee hissed low on the stove. Elias leaned against the counter, sleeves rolled, eyes on the window. Clara was on the porch already, barefoot, her toes curled slightly against the planks like she was feeling the grain of the wood, not testing it, just knowing it was hers now. She'd come to sit there most mornings, the same chair that once stayed empty for years, the one Elias never used, never looked at, except maybe when no one was watching. Now it held her weight like it remembered someone finally, and beside her was a second cup of coffee waiting. Elias stepped out, the door creaking soft, not from age but from familiarity, like a greeting, not a groan. She didn't look up, just tilted the second cup slightly toward him without a word. He sat. No one said, "Thank you." That belonged to a different kind of story, one where debts were spoken aloud. This was something quieter. Clara watched the horizon, not searching, just steady, like the land itself didn't surprise her anymore. The wind caught a loose strand of her hair and pressed it against her cheek. She didn't brush it away. Elias didn't offer to either. It stayed there a while, like it had a right to. Then he said, low, without looking at her, "I'm not here to fix you. You're not broken. I just made space for you to rest." She turned her head a little, not enough to meet his eyes, just enough to let the words land where they needed. Behind them, the house breathed. Not literally, of course. But if you'd lived long enough with silence, with memory stitched into every beam, you'd know what that meant. The boards creaked, not from strain, but from holding two people again, like lungs remembering how to fill. The shawl Elias once left on the stair rail was now folded at the foot of the bed. Clara had mended it, stitched in a bit of that red scarf she wore the day they wed. In the hallway, a small scrap of cloth hung where the light touched it at noon. Faint embroidery read, "Boone and Clara, not kept but chosen." The photograph of Elias's first wife had never returned to the mantel. It wasn't discarded, just moved gently to a drawer. A place of peace, not shame. Clara never asked where, never needed to. The house had changed without a hammer, without paint, just by someone staying. In town, they still talked, but quieter now. Less with judgment, more with curiosity. Or maybe even respect. Rachel still brought over bread. A few others asked Clara about mending shirts, stitching quilts. But it was never the town's approval that made the change stick. It was mornings like this, two people, two chairs, and no need for anything louder than the creak of the porch under their feet. Because some homes don't rise with walls and shingles. They grow with stillness, with patience, with someone who doesn't leave when it gets quiet. Out in Boone Hollow, the wind still passes through the porch railings, soft as breath, and most days you'll find two cups on the table. One steaming, one waiting. Clara's not the girl from the square anymore. She walks barefoot because she wants to, not because she was left that way. And Elias, he still doesn't say much. But when he looks at her, something quiet settles in the air, like the land finally knowing it's no longer empty. Some homes aren't built with nails. They're built with patience and someone willing to stay. If this story sat with you, even just a little, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Not for the noise, but for the connection, because out here words don't need to be loud to mean something.